Good afternoon and welcome to Emmett's weekly webinar featuring the brilliant historian, Dr. Daniel Pipes, who will be discussing his new and important book, Israel Victory: How Zionists Win Acceptance and Palestinians Get Liberated. In the interest of time, and because I assume that most of you are familiar with Dr. Pipes' work, I'm going to forego reading his extensive bio, which was also included in the invitation for today's program. Thank you all for your continued support for the important work that we do here at Emmet. And I encourage everyone to consider sponsoring a future webinar or making a donation at emmetonline.org so that we may continue to fight for Israel, the Jewish people, and U.S. national security. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for viewing at a later date, and please feel free to share the link far and wide. If you have any questions, you can place them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try to get to as many as possible a bit later in the program. Please do limit your submissions to brief questions only. Welcome, Daniel, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the kind words.
I've been a big proponent of the Middle East Forum's Israel Victory Project since you first announced it in 2000 basis and practical reasoning behind your thesis, as well as helping to define what victory actually means, what's prevented it to date, and how to get there, particularly in the context of world conflicts. So we can discuss a bit later how October 7th altered your analysis, but I'd like to start with you sharing with our audience what your thesis is, what an Israel victory looks like, and how realistic you believe that is in the context of today's geopolitical situation.
My basic point is that conflicts, wars, end when one side gives up. It's intuitive. If we're fighting, we keep fighting until one side gives up. Look at Korea. Neither side has given up. It could reignite as we're speaking. Conflicts end when one side gives up. This is a basic fact of human life that has been lost, in particular after World War II and the atomic bomb. At that point, Americans first and others, and those more generally mentality towards the Palestinians, they're not trying to win, they're trying to manage. But management just goes on and on. And I'm suggesting that they should stop managing and start winning.
It seems basically common sense, and yet it's been so difficult to achieve that. So you break your book down. The first half of it analyzes the two main barriers to Israel victory. The first of which is Palestinian rejectionism, which you point out consists of a 140-year-old Palestinian refusal to recognize Israel, as well as an unwavering commitment to its destruction. You also point out that Palestinian identity became inextricably tied to rejectionism, which has survived numerous wars and treaties with little impact. So can you spend some time discussing this, including the use of violence and delegitimization, the latter of which you recognize as succeeding to a greater extent than the former?
Right. The initial response of the people we now call Palestinians back in the 1880s was to say no to the Zionists. We don't want you. We hate you. We're going to kill you. And this evolved over time into something larger, more nationalistic, more ideological by the 1920s, and has remained the dominant, not the exclusive, but the dominant attitude of Palestinians towards Israelis, Israel, Jews, Judaism, and the like. It is dysfunctional, but it is deep, and it is broad, and it is dominant. It has, as you said, two aspects, the violent and the nonviolent. The nonviolent is obvious, murder and other destruction. The nonviolent is delegitimization, is saying that Israel is an apartheid state, a white national state, neo-Nazi state, colonial state. And while the violence has in general not succeeded in the sense that it has not demoralized Israel, it has cost human lives, to be sure, but it has not fundamentally altered Israel's progress. Delegitimation has, and indeed since October 7th, there have been some 1,200, 1,300 deaths, but the larger threat to Israel is a possible next president of the United States who sees Israel as an enemy, as a terrorist, as a genocidal state. That is far more important, I think, than the deaths, than the violence. And the Israelis have, in general, focused on violence rather than delegitimization. They have, in general, looked at the wrong. It's at the wrong threat. Because it's immediate, it's right there, it's bloody. But I think the delegitimization, which is more abstract, is actually more threatening.
You lay out in great detail the idea that the second barrier to Israel victory is Israeli conciliation, which seeks to win Israel's acceptance from Palestinians through enrichment and placation rather than coercion. You stated, quote, conciliation is to Zionists as rejectionism is to Palestinians, a constant and unique mentality that goes back to the Ottoman period. It represents the polar opposite of rejectionism, but has lasted equally long and has a no less futile record. As with rejectionism, conciliation once had a certain logic. Today, it lacks any. Can you elaborate on this? And in particular, please touch on why, despite Israel's constant enrichment and placation of the Palestinians, their hatred and violence never end?
Rejectionism is somewhat well known. It's not too subtle. What I'm conciliation, it's my own term, and it's my own analysis. I've not seen it elsewhere. And what I noticed is that, again, going back to the 1880s, there's a constancy, despite all the changes that have taken place. The Zionists were a handful in the earliest days. They were very weak for decades. Now they're strong. And yet, this mentality of hoping that by winning over the Palestinians, ever. And yet it remains to this day the guiding principle of Israeli mentality towards the Palestinians. And within conciliation, I see two different themes. One is enrichment. So as early as the 1880s, the first Zionists said to their Palestinian neighbors, we will bring you better roads, cleaner water, new ports, you will gain. And as recently as a few weeks ago, the Israelis have invited money to go to Gaza in order to help try and win some benefits psychologically, politically. It's a constant. The other, what I call placation, I only trace back to the Oslo Accords, that is, say, just over 30 years ago. Until then, the Israeli security establishment was quite tough. Since then, since Oslo, the security establishment is very timid, very cautious, not wanting to upset anyone. Now, of course, tactically they do violent things, but strategically the goal is to be gentle with the Palestinians in order that the Palestinians not be upset, violent with them. So these two strains together, enrichment and placation, amount to what I call conciliation. And it hasn't worked. It goes contrary to all of human history. I mean, look, when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine 2.5 years ago, was the immediate Western response to send money to Vladimir Putin in the hopes that he will be appeased? No, it was to cut off all commercial ties, or almost all commercial ties. And that's the natural response in ancient times, medieval times, modern times, pre-atomic weaponry, after the atomic bomb. You want to get your enemy to be weaker, not strengthening him. But that has been a Zionist history. To strengthen, to improve the lot of the Palestinians. And it goes against all logic, and it hasn't worked.
So I'm glad you brought up the Oslo Accords. I think it's important to spend a few minutes on that. You describe it as Israel's Nakba, and there were numerous peace plans in the Oslo Accords wake. Oslo was intended to lead to peace, but instead you recognize that it had the opposite effect, inflaming and rewarding Palestinian hostility and instilling hope in the Palestinians that only led to an extension of the conflict. And then you point out further Israel's unilateral withdrawal from both Lebanon in 2000, Gaza in 2005. unilateral offers of peace. You list actually 27 plans since Oslo to end the conflict that have bolstered the Palestinians' perception of Israel as weak and ripe for collapse. You stated, I'm going to quote you, thus did Israel's extravagant mistakes turn a would-be peace process into a war process. What are the lessons that Israel should have learned from all of these mistakes over the past 3 decades? And do you believe they have actually learned them? It's a better question.
No, they've not learned them. And even after October 7th, it looked like for a few weeks they learned them, but I don't think so. Prime Minister Netanyahu is talking about victory, 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 but it doesn't seem like he has the security establishment with him. It doesn't seem like he has a significant part of the population with him, which wants the hostages back rather than victory. No, I don't think there's been a big change. I think it goes on because it is the tradition. It is what Zionism is about, is being positive towards the Palestinian enemy. And by the way, I'm specifically talking about Palestinians, not Arab states. Syria and the others. That's a very different topic. I'm talking about the people in what was British mandatory Palestine, Israel, West Bank, Gaza. That's a very special case. And I would argue that the attitude of the Palestinians, not the further Arabs, not Muslims in general, but the Palestinians specifically, is something unique in history. To maintain this genocidal rage for a century and more is extraordinary. There's no other case. I mean, take, for example, the Turkish-Armenian problem, which was genocide a century ago. Well, it's over. There are no genocidal camps of Turks planning to murder Armenians. Yeah, there are tensions, to be sure. Not going to prettify it, but it's a normal kind of conflict. You don't see the Turks going around the world talking about the horrors of Armenia and Armenians as neo-Nazis and the like. It was a brief genocidal moment, and it ended. In the case of it just basically foreclosed something special. And therefore, when outsiders come to it, they don't understand it. They see it as a commonplace. Can you hear me?
Daniel?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we lost you for a second, but there you are.
Yeah. So therefore, because it's unique, because this genocidal impulse has gone on for close to a century and a half, excuse me, outsiders tend not to understand it. They see it as a normal conflict. Egypt and Israel, that was a normal conflict, is a normal conflict. But the Palestinians in Israel, not normal. It takes an understanding of the uniqueness in order to begin to be able to solve it. But historically, outsiders, Oslo Accord among the many attempts, have failed, have seen this as normal. So George Mitchell, who had success in Ireland, was appointed by 2 Democratic presidents, Clinton and Obama, to try and solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And he failed completely because he came with an understanding that was, this is like Ireland. No, it's not like Ireland. It's something sui generis.
Do you think there is anybody in the current international leadership that understands the problem?
Javier Milei of Argentina, perhaps.
I think that's where a lot of us Jews are saying we're going to end up if things continue going the way they do here. So what role has both the left and the international community, which includes the US under the Obama and Biden administrations, as you mentioned Biden earlier, what role have they played in helping to sustain Palestinian rejectionism and furthering Palestinian delegitimization of Israel? Given the anti-Israel animus that pervades the UN and other international organizations, culminating in the most recent opinion of the International Court of Justice that Israel is violating international law by occupying the West Bank and Jerusalem, and threats to issue arrest warrants by the International Criminal Court. Is it even possible for Israel to defeat the Palestinians? And can an aggressive Israeli PR campaign change that? Or is it so ingrained in human nature to hate and scapegoat Jews after 3 millennia of doing so that ultimately Israel really is on her own?
I don't think Israel has been abandoned. It has strong relations with the United States.
Daniel, you're frozen.
Okay.
Daniel, we're having trouble hearing you.
Okay.
We're still having trouble hearing you. Okay.
All right. I just turn it off and on and hope for the best. Israel has strong allies. They're not uncritical allies, but they're allies. Israel's not alone by any means. For Israel to shift from management to victory will create problems, but as we perhaps will get in later, I don't see Israel's defeating the Palestinians as a military campaign. I see it more as a psychological campaign, more about messaging and less about violence. As for the Biden administration specifically, the remarkable thing is that the Biden administration is the first one in decades not to have plans how to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that's a really good thing. So while I have many criticisms of Biden and his administration vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians, a big applause for not having a plan. I mean, think, Trump had a plan, Obama had a plan, Bush had unending numbers of plans, Clinton had plans, first Bush had plans, Reagan had plans, Carter had plans. It goes back a long way. So finally, we had an administration without plans. That was a good thing. Now you, Laurie, are off screen. We're having trouble. Okay, you're back.
I apologize to both for having technological issues this afternoon. Perhaps the Iranians found us.
Perhaps.
Okay, so Daniel, you point out in your book that you completed your manuscript and it to the publisher 1 week before the October conflict, but also your conclusion, which you had to then revise before the book reached publication. So can you share with us how October 7th altered your views about Israel victory and what actions it would need to take in order to achieve that victory? I shared with you a quote that I had seen that Eugene Kontorovich, who wrote back in May that quote, Hamas's grisly terror raid on October 7th has proved to be the single most stunningly successful act in gaining support for the Palestinian cause. Do you agree with Eugene? And in this context, also, please share your thoughts on the absolutely insane post-10/7 push for a Palestinian state by the Biden administration and international community at large.
Well, there are a lot of questions there. As far as my book is concerned, I thought for about 3 weeks after October 7th that my book was not needed because the Israelis had come on their own to the conclusion that they needed victory. Quite quickly, by the end of October, I found no, they had not really changed. Yes, Prime Minister Netanyahu has spoken of victory. I've counted, and I found it's over 60 times, over 60 different speeches. And when he came to the United States a couple of days ago on his brand new Wings of Zion plane, he had in front of him a baseball cap in English saying total victory. So it's in the air, but I don't think the policies are really designed to achieve victory. As for the impact of October 7th, yes, it has created a very intense hostility to Israel, on the left in particular. Note, the left, not the Muslims. If you look, say, at the encampments at American universities in the spring, it was the left. And the harder left you go, the more intense the antagonism. You see the same in Congress. Rashida Tlaib, possibly the furthest most left member of Congress, is the one calling Israel a genocidal state. So it is the left that has been aroused. But I also think there has been aroused a perhaps less dramatic, but also strong pro-Israel sentiment on the right. I mean, for example, Mike Johnson, when he became Speaker of the House, the first thing he did was push through aid to Israel. That was all the things in front of the Speaker of the House, that the Israel animus. So it's aroused stronger feelings about Israel on both sides. I don't think it's all negative. It is also, I would argue that the antics of the far left in its hostility against Israel are counterproductive. You know, I mean, think back a few months, it's not anymore the case, but the far left was blocking people getting to major airports around the United States, desecrating US military memorials, impeding medical procedures at hospitals. This is not the way to win friends. I don't think, short term, it clearly shows an antagonism to Israel, but long term, I don't think this is the way to make friends. I think there's a counterproductive nature to the anti-Israel activities. So I'm less worried about it than many others.
Can you also touch on the insanity of the two-state solution? And by the way, as you talk about the left, Democratic congressmen who boycott Bibi's speech this evening.
Well, this tradition of boycotting began in 2015 at his last address to joint session of Congress. I don't think it's occurred to any other foreign leader, but it's now a tradition. I don't think it's terribly important, but it does show the kind of high emotion, uniquely high emotion, that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict engenders. And by the way, again, it's Palestinian, not Arab. Back in the day, 1948 to 1973, when it was the Arab states against Israel, you did not see such high emotions. Yeah, there were emotions. This is unique. And there's no other conflict in the world that engendered two giant states fighting each other. This is a small state with a non-state actor. This is unusual. As for the two-state solution, I take a somewhat different view from many of my friends.
Could you maybe turn your camera off? Could be isn't. Okay.
Okay.
I heard the last I heard back in the day.
Oh, back in the day when it was the Arab states, the emotions were not so high. They were high, but not this high. This is unique, especially as the conflict is a small one between a small state of under 10 million people and a non-state actor. This is not China and India fighting each other. This is not some giant world upheaval, but yet the emotions are so high. As for the two-state solution, I see it somewhat different from many of my friends. The idea of a two-state solution now is absurd. Why should the Palestinians be strengthened when the dominant force among the Palestinians is the destruction of Israel? Why would Israel accede to that? Why would Israel's friends want that? It's crazy. That said, in the long term, when the day comes that the Palestinians do accept the Jewish state of Israel, and I believe that could happen, indeed, that's the goal of my book, to bring that closer. When that day comes, and it won't come soon, it'll take decades, but when that day comes, then this two-state solution is pretty good. The Egyptians have indicated consistently for decades they don't want to go back to Gaza. The Jordanians have indicated for decades they don't want to go back to the West Bank. So what's the alternative? I am totally against Israel running these areas. I think that is a huge mistake. I do not think Israel should seek to rule or Gaza. And therefore, what is one left with but a ultimate state turning up? So I'm not against it in principle. I'm very much against it at present and for a long time to come. But as a goal for the future, I'm fine with it.
And I just wanted to also ask you, you mentioned, in the context of Israel post 10/7, disappointment in Israel's actions and the way they're fighting the war and whatnot. Isn't that mostly in part because of international pressure, and in particular the pressure of the Biden administration, threats to withhold weapons and demands to provide humanitarian aid in a war zone and whatnot?
Friends of Israel are constantly tempted to blame the United States and other Western countries for the problems that Israel had. Israel's problems are of Israel's making. The fact that the Israelis don't have the weapons necessary is Israel's fault. The fact that the Israelis left the West Bank in 2005 and allowed Hamas to come to power is Israel's fault. Don't blame the United States. Don't expect American politicians to fix the mistakes that Israelis have made. No, these are Israeli mistakes. The Israelis had no plan on October 7th. They were completely unprepared. Not only were they unprepared to defend the territories that were invaded that day, but they had no plans. It took them weeks and weeks. What you see on Israel's side is an incompetent security establishment. Now, that's a radical thing to say because most people, I bet yourself included, think of the Israeli security establishment as tremendously accomplished. Well, it was, yeah. From the 1880s to the 1960s, it was tremendous against great odds. This small group, in the early days, not even a state, managed over and over again to defeat its enemies. 1948, 49, 1967, these are extraordinary. But that ended in 1967, and 1967 is what, 57 years ago, a long time. And all we've seen since then, while putting aside tactical successes, Entebbe or stealing the Iranian nuclear files, what we've seen is incompetent strategic failure. After 1967, the Israelis made tremendous mistakes in the West Bank and Gaza. 1973 was obviously a tremendous mistake, completely unprepared. 1993 was an incredible mistake. You quoted me earlier, Israel's Nakba. 2005, the withdrawal from Gaza. Incredible. Self-goal, own goal, making your own mistakes. Don't blame this on the Americans. Don't blame this on outsiders. The Israelis have created their own problems and
So while I mean, I completely understand and agree with what you're saying, but there's also the situation since Obama entered office in which Obama and Biden decided to put daylight between the U.S. and Israel. There was a terrific interview in the Wall Street Journal this past weekend with Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz, and he stated, we don't ask anyone to fight instead of our soldiers. It's a principle for us. But recognizing that Israel can't stand alone, he added, we need you to back us and to let our enemies know that you back us. I also agree that with Trump, that I don't think 10/7 would have happened had he been in office, because there wouldn't have been that daylight, and because the Saudis would have probably have joined the Abraham Accords by now. But even if all that hadn't happened, the war would have looked differently, I think, because, Trump would have ensured that Iran and all of its proxies were aware that the U.S. was backing Israel, both militarily and cognitively. So, I mean, isn't Israel victory also dependent on who occupies the White House?
No, it is not. There's always been daylight between Israel and the United States, between Jerusalem and Washington. There's always been. Pick a president, and we can look at the record, and you'll see them no end of tensions and problems. Overall, I would say the Obama years were pretty quiet. Obama had dinner and made Netanyahu wait in the anteroom for him to finish his dinner. There was a great deal of upset. But no, there were no fundamental problems. And there were problems during the Trump years. You remember when Netanyahu misunderstood Trump and thought he was endorsing annexation of the West Bank? Created a lot of problems. No, there are always problems. And there always will be problems. And they're two very different states with very different places in the world.
Well, where would you say, I'm sorry,
I do not see that the Biden, I would not say that the Biden administration has had particularly great problems. Certain coolness, yeah. But for example, Abraham Accords, which they were cool to initially, they adopted. They did provide arms, they provide intelligence. And by the way, when it comes to Americans fighting on behalf of Israel, that's nonsense. The United States just came to the defense of Israel. And what was it, April 13th, when the Iranians attacked with all those drones and missiles? We protected Israel. And the Israelis said, thank you. No, they need us. And they got us. We protected them. Israel has its own decisions to make. It can make those as a sovereign state, but it has made wrong decisions for decades now, at fundamental levels. I mean, leaving Gaza, what kind of insanity was that? You have an enemy population at your doorstep, and you bring an enemy leader to take it over. Who does that? It's pure incompetence. No, let the Israelis take responsibility for their own errors. Don't blame them on Americans.
So you mentioned the Iranian attack on Israel, in which the U.S. and other countries did come to Israel's defense. But isn't that all due to the realignment? You know, as Mike Duran and Tony Badran have written about Obama's realignment of the Middle East and empowering Iran, therefore empowering Iran's proxies financially as well. I mean, the one thing I would say about Trump is that the sanctions did appear to bring Iran's economy down to its knees, and instead now we've been pumping money back, which is going to the Houthis, and Hamas, Hezbollah. So what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with your analysis. No question that Obama and now Biden have tried to win Iranian favor and reach the JCPOA, no question. But let me ask you, why did the Israelis back in 2008-9, as Bush was leaving office and Obama was coming in, why did they take out the Iranian nuclear facilities? Why did they do it? They could have. Why didn't they? They took out they took out the Syrian ones in 2007, just a year earlier. They took out the Iraqi ones in 1981. Why did they take out the Iranian ones? Why have the Israelis allowed this to go on? Why did the Israelis allow what is now estimated 200,000 missiles and rockets in Hezbollah's hands in Lebanon? Can't blame Americans for this. Yeah, of course. I'm not whitewashing American policy. I'm not saying why American policy is not important, but I'm saying that it's secondary. The Israelis have their own security concerns, and they have made mistakes. Whether it be Iran or the Palestinians. The Israelis should have taken care of Iran a long time, or the Iranian nuclear facilities a long time ago, before they were so deep in the ground. Should have done it.
That's an excellent point. I mean, I always understood the fact that they didn't have the bunker busters needed, but I believe, you know, back in 2009 was the time to do it, as you point out, before everything was so deep underground. I mean, when I was in Israel in February with the Middle East Forum, which was a terrific trip, as I've discussed on prior webinars, my takeaway was that it was wonderful, really. My takeaway was that Israelis of all ideologies were completely united on the need for victory. And you lay out a case for Israel's victory and defeat of the Palestinians in the final chapter, but has the length of the war and the discontent with the Netanyahu government that has failed to bring the hostages home weakened Israeli unity? And how do you see this playing out in the coming months and years?
Well, you were on the ground.
Yeah,
sorry.
well, that was in February, and I think I fear that a lot's changed in terms of the unity that I saw in Israel. It seems to have dissipated, and we see Israelis in Washington that are protesting Bibi right now.
You're on the ground, and I won't dispute your experience, but my analysis of Israeli attitudes since October 7th is different. I see Israel divided into two camps: the victory camp, or the destroy Hamas camp, on the one hand, and the hostage camp, bring the hostages home camp, on the other. And they're contradictory. You cannot negotiate with Hamas to get the hostages home and simultaneously destroy Hamas. It's one or the other. And the hostage, what I'm calling the hostage camp, is strong. It's on the streets. It's got representation in parliament. It has a powerful voice, and it has impeded Israeli actions to a considerable extent. So I think they're two competing visions. And so long as over 100,
I think we lost you, Daniel.
decades were saying.
Now I can hear you.
Where did you lose me?
We lost 100.
So as there are over 100 hostages left, and so long as there are these hostages, Israel remains divided. And the victory impulse is impeded by the bring home the hostages impulse. You can't do both at once. And let me remind you that it was the Israelis who fashioned this notion of never negotiating with terrorists. Well, what's happened? Immediately after October 7th, the urge on a large part of the population's part was negotiate with terrorists, bring them back no matter what. I have quotes from ex-generals who say the most important thing is to bring back the hostages. What kind of understanding of security and strategy is that? Your goal is to bring back the hostages. That's the point.
I was actually with some Israelis a couple of days ago having this conversation, and I've had a similar conversation with family in Israel, that you have to bring the hostages back. If you don't, then Israel will never be the same, and it will destroy Israel if the hostages are simply abandoned by the country. Now, their theory is to bring back the hostages and negotiate for the hostages and then destroy Hamas. So I don't think that they would have respected any kind of ceasefire that would have been required to bring the hostages home. But as somebody who doesn't have a child fighting in the IDF or living in Israel, I think it's easier for me to take the stand that I agree with you. What you're never going to end this if you keep negotiating and handing over 1,000 Sinwars for every one Gilad Shalit. So I just want to touch on the Abraham Accords. On the one hand, we could argue that it proves that Israel's strong and that leads to peace. But on the other, you could also argue that it led to October 7th, since it seems that Hamas's goal was to stop the Saudis from joining. And how do you think that these Gulf nations and others in the region are viewing Israel's actions in the Gaza war, in particular also its restraint with Hezbollah and until recently the Houthis? I can't hear you, Daniel. Oh, okay. I'm sorry to everybody. There we have you.
Good. My understanding of the Arab Israeli, not Palestinian Israeli, Arab Israeli conflict is as follows. It was a local Palestinian conflict until 1948. It was local. In 1948, the Arab states came in to the conflict. Egypt, Transjordan, Syria. And for 25 years, it was the Arab states that dominated. And those of you who were around then and remember, you'll recall the balance of power charts that were being drawn up between Israeli tanks, planes, and ships on the one hand, and Jordanian, Syrian, Egyptian forces on the other. These were two sets of states fighting each other. Starting in 1973, the Arab states began to pull out. And for the next 51 years, the Arab states had been pulling out. And it has reverted to a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Sadat's trip to Jerusalem in 1977 was the first major signal of this, followed by a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. In 1994, a Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty. In 2020, 4 more Arab states joined in. And look at October 7th. The Arab states, including even Iraq and Syria and Algeria, have been quiet. They put out perfunctory condemnations of Israel, but they have no energy behind it, no interest in it. The Arab states found Israel, anti-Zionism, to be a useful, mobilizing force from 48 to 73. But then they found it to be a tiger that they could no longer ride, and they pulled back. It was expensive. They lost people. They just lost. So they pulled back. And the Arab states have been pulling back more and more until right now they're out. Iran and Turkey, which initially were not part of this hostility to Israel, are in, sure, but not the Arab states. They're gone. And the Abraham Accords codifies that. The fact that Saudi Arabia is getting close to it is another indication. The Arab states don't want to be fighting Israel. And indeed, some of them want Israel as a implicit ally against the real threat, which is Iran. So Arab states are not the issue. And by the way, the encampments in American universities are not due to Arab states. Arab states are far larger in every sense, geographic, demographic, economic, than Israel. Nobody particularly cares about the Arab states. The passion is about the Palestinians, and not just any Palestinian, not the Palestinians of Syria who are under extreme duress due to the civil war there, nor Lebanon, where they have very much discriminated against, nor elsewhere, just the West Bank, Gaza, and to a somewhat lesser extent, Eastern Jerusalem. That's all the world cares about. That is Israel's problem. Israel's problem is the Palestinians, the Gazans, the West Bankers, and the Eastern Jerusalemites. The Arab states, when the Arab states signed up their accords with Israel, the outside world, the left in particular, couldn't care less. It's not what their issue is. Just like they don't care about the cost of cottage cheese in Israel or Ashkenazi-Mizrahi relations. These are not its concerns. Its concern is the so-called open concentration camp or prison of Gaza, the West Bank, and Eastern Jerusalem. So that's what Israel needs to address, are the West Bankers, the Gazans, and Eastern Jerusalemites. And that's what I try and address in this book. And to take the next step, I think Israel needs to address these people, which it has not done. It has to convince these people that they are making a mistake, that Israel is not their dire enemy, that it is not. They are not suffering, as Mahmoud Abbas put it a few years ago in Germany. He said they are suffering 50 Holocausts. It is up to Israel to convince them otherwise, and Israel has the power, the economic and other powers to influence Palestinian ideas. And I believe there are already quite a few Palestinians, Gazans, West Bankers, East Jerusalemites, and also Israeli Muslim citizens, Arabic-speaking Muslim, who understand this. There is considerable dissent. It's suppressed. Israel doesn't pay it any attention. Israel's never looked to its friends among the Palestinians, applauded them, funded them, helped them. It hasn't done it. And that's what I'm advocating. I'm not advocating warfare. I'm advocating that Israel still continue to pay attention to, say, American college students. They're important too. But more important than American college students are Palestinians, be they in the jails or in the schools or wherever they are. Israel has never paid attention to this population. The Israeli attitude is that Palestinians are their permanent enemy. It's understandable. They have been for generations. Doesn't mean they always will be, must be. I believe the Israelis should focus on their Palestinian neighbors, help those who are friendly to them, and encourage others to come over to end this conflict. It's pretty simple. It's pretty obvious, but it hasn't been tried.
Well, just to take that one step further before I turn to the audience questions, and we will get to them in just a moment. You know, when you talk about that, I mean, the southern communities, the kibbutz Kfar Aza, where we went on the Middle East Forum trip, and the other kibbutzim down south, were welcoming the Palestinians from Gaza into their homes. And that was a total fail. So when you look at the polling that's been done post 10/7, and it looks like not only the Palestinians living in Gaza still support Hamas, although they're not happy with the situation, obviously, but even the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria seem to support at least the actions of Hamas on 10/7. So how do you reconcile that with your thesis?
There are plenty of Israelis who have been friendly towards Palestinians. They've driven them to medical appointments. They've invited them into their homes. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about being friendly. I'm talking about a tough police state approach. This is not kindness. This is not appeasement. This is not conciliation. This is being tough. This is working with your friends against your enemies. To be specific, in Gaza, what I want to see in Gaza is an Israeli-sponsored, Gazan-run police state. Not about being nice. I want to see the Gazans in charge, and I want to see decent Gazans apply police state tactics to run Gaza. This is not a democracy. Not for many years to come. Eventually, sure, it'd be great. But for now, tough. I want to see a police state like you see in Egypt and Jordan. A police state where if you lead your life without politics, you're okay. Mess with politics, you're in trouble. Attack the ruler, the leader, you're in big trouble. No, can't do that. So I'm not about being nice to the Palestinians. I am wanting to push them using the strengths that Israel has in the right direction. But it's psychological. It's not military. It's reverting to force when you have to, but not depending on force. In other words, the Palestinian, I'm a believer in ideas. I will live in the world of ideas. And the Palestinians have, especially in the 1920s, under Amin al-Husseini, developed some terrible ideas. Amin al-Husseini was so extreme that there's strong evidence to suggest that he is the one who influenced Hitler to engage in the final solution. This remains in place, this rejectionism. It's not as strong as it was then, but it's still there. And it needs to be fought with other ideas, not by force, but by other ideas. And Israel can sponsor these ideas. The Palestinians who are friendly to Israel are too weak. They don't have the money, they don't have the power. They can't do this on their own. They need Israel's help. That's what I'm advocating. Israel to work with its Palestinian friends, or at least not enemies, to develop a different kind of society. And now it has a chance in Gaza, at least it had. I don't know if it's still there anymore. The Israelis have bungled Gaza so badly, I don't know if they can anymore. But certainly it looked like that a few months ago. And that's what I hope the Israelis will do, to break conciliation and look at the Palestinians as not people they are nice to, but people whom they influence through their power.
So I'm looking at the audience questions, and someone this. I think this is a good follow-up to your response just now. How do you facilitate the acceptance of Israel by the Palestinians?
Well, first of all, you look at schools, you look at media, you look at sermons, you look at jails, you use the educational system, the religious system, the political system, the media system, and you use it. something the Israelis don't do. They don't even do it in Israel proper. The schools in Israel proper, the Arabic language schools, are hostile to Zionism. The media in Israel proper is hostile. They don't, and Israel proper is a different story. It's a democracy. They can't do the same things in Israel proper. But in the West Bank and Gaza, they can do what they want. And I'm not encouraging violence. I'm encouraging steps taken to bring a change in the Palestinian mentality. Now, it's not like all Palestinians at present are hostile to Israel. I would say my estimate is, going back a century and more, about a fifth of the Palestinians, some 20%, have been willing to live with the Yishuv and then Israel. I would like to see Israeli policy be dedicated to increasing 20% to 30, 40, 50, 60, 70%. That should be the goal. Now, how exactly they go about that is not really my bailiwick. I'm not in psychology. I'm not a colonel in IDF. I can't get too much into specifics, but I would like to see that be the goal. And I would like to see messaging be the mechanism to achieve that goal. Unfortunately, as I said before, Israelis preemptively give up this goal by assuming that Palestinians are the perpetual enemy. I draw the analogy to lions and hyenas. If you know anything about the animal kingdom, lions and hyenas have been, since time immemorial, enemies. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Israelis and Palestinians are not animals. They're not predestined to be enemies forever. The Israelis can bring about changes, but that means, first of all, the Israelis bringing about changes in their own attitudes, in their own mentality. And that's what I'm trying to spur with this book. From the outside, I might add.
This is a timely question. The PA and well, they said Gaza, but it's really it was Fatah and the PA signed an agreement yesterday in China. What do you think that the impact of that is?
They've signed such agreements before. None of them have led to much. So one tends to disregard it as just another effort. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe this will lead to something this time, but I'm inclined to think that it will go nowhere. Look, their goals are identical, the destruction of the Jewish state. But their means, their tactics, their personnel, their ideology all differ. At base, the PA is willing to do what it needs to do, like the PLO before it. It is a chameleon. It can be leftist, it can be Islamist, it can negotiate with Israel, it can attack Israel, it does all these things. Hamas is a far more ideologically consistent enterprise, and it has strengths and weaknesses that come from that. Overall, it looks like strengths. Hamas is doing much better than the PA, but I find it hard to see, short of one side capitulating, short of the PA capitulating to Hamas, I find it hard to see that they can really reach an agreement that will be meaningful. So I tend to think it'll be just one more piece of paper.
There's a question about the willful blindness of the West to the fact that the Palestinians actually really don't want two states. They just want one state without Israel. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, there is a willful blindness, or to put it differently, there's an misunderstanding of the nature of the conflict. It's seen as a conventional conflict where you're fighting over borders, you're fighting over something that can be managed, that can be compromised. You're fighting over water, you're fighting over electricity, you're fighting over roads, you're fighting over land. This can be compromised. There is not an understanding of Palestinian rejectionism. There's not an understanding that this is an unrequited genocidal movement that will not accept Israel. And it takes a leap of imagination. I compare in the book this genocidal Palestinian rejectionism with the French Revolution and Soviet Russia. French Revolution was something completely new in history. People who went through it had a very difficult time understanding what they were experiencing. There had never been anything like that anywhere. Soviet Russia, a totalitarian regime, was unlike anything that came before. I would argue, at a much smaller scale to be sure, but that Palestinian genocidal rejectionism is something new. It doesn't exist elsewhere. And therefore, it's difficult for those who live in and around it to understand.
Following up with what you discussed about the police state in Gaza, how do you prevent that from not becoming another Hamastan?
I would like to see the Israelis, again, I'm not sure if it's still possible. I would like to have seen the Israelis find among the Gazans those who are ready to work with them to establish administration, the police force, and the other institutions of modern life, and to keep a very close eye on them. The Gazans would be running it, but the Israelis would be there in the background, making sure that they do the right thing. It would be a little like a colonial administration. And as time goes on, the Israelis could withdraw as trust grew, as institutions developed. But initially, it would be the Gazans working on behalf of Israel. Now, the reason why I'm pessimistic is that the Israelis have not been forceful enough. And those Gazans who have shown a willingness to work with Israel have been murdered. So it makes it hard for others to come forward. The Israelis should have provided proper power protection for these people. Apparently, they have not.
Do you see any individuals in the Israeli government or outside of Israeli government who could replace the current Israeli leadership to take the steps that you advocate?
Yes and no. There are definitely elements in the Likud party who agree. The foreword of my book was written by Danny Danon, the former and now again current Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. There are others like him who agree, but the restrictions, the challenge of convincing the security